William Wallace is one of the most famous figures in Scottish history, although his real life is shrouded in many uncertainties and legends. In the public imagination, he was made famous primarily by the Hollywood film Braveheart, which turned him into a symbol of an indomitable fighter for freedom. The real Wallace, however, lived a life that was very different, less fairy tale-like, but full of political intrigue, military conflict, and the harsh reality of medieval Scotland. The filmmakers embellished or completely invented many events to make his story more dramatic and more accessible for audiences. In this video, we will look at the real story of William Wallace, from his birth, through his famous battles, to his capture and brutal execution. William Wallace was a Scottish landholder and belonged to the lower Scottish nobility, but surprisingly little is known about his origins and family. His own seal from 1297, found on a letter sent to the Hanseatic city of Lubeck, names his father as Alan Wallace. This man may also appear in the so-called Ragman rolls of 1296, where he is mentioned as a royal landholder in Ayrshire, but there is no definite confirmation. Some later sources, especially the poet Blind Harry, who wrote the heroic epic The Wallace at the end of the 15th century, name his father as Malcolm of Elderslie. This established the widespread belief that William was born either in Elderslie in Renfrewshire or in Ayrshire, but no contemporary evidence confirms this. In any case, the Wallace family owned estates in southwestern Scotland, for example in Rickcarton, Tarbolton, and Auchincruve, and were vassals of the powerful Stuart family. The surname Wallace itself has an interesting origin. It comes from the Old English word Wyllisk, meaning foreigner or Welshman. It could refer either to immigrants from Wales or to the native inhabitants of the former Brittonic kingdom of Strathclyde, who spoke a language related to Welsh. The film Braveheart treats these facts very loosely. At the beginning of the film, William is shown as a poor, dirty little boy dressed in sackcloth, living in a straw hut. In reality, however, he belonged to the lower nobility and lived in an environment much closer to knightly circles than to peasant poverty. It is also untrue that Wallace as a child witnessed the death of his father and brother in battles against the English. At the time when the conflict between Scotland and England fully erupted, Wallace was already an adult man, and the family losses shown in the film have no solid historical basis. When William Wallace was growing up, Scotland was ruled by King Alexander III. His long reign brought the kingdom a period of peace and prosperity. This changed on March 19, 1286, when Alexander died after falling from his horse. His granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, became the heir to the throne. She was still a child and lived in Norway, so the Scottish nobles established a government of guardians. Margaret did set out on a journey to Scotland, but became seriously ill at sea and died in Orkney in September 1290. With her death, the direct royal line of Alexander's dynasty ended and Scotland fell into a serious crisis. This was followed by a period known as the Great Cause, during which more than 10 candidates claimed the throne. The most serious contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder, the grandfather of the future King Robert the Bruce. To prevent civil war, the Scots asked the English king Edward I to arbitrate the dispute. Edward, however, forced all the claimants to first recognize his overlordship over Scotland. In 1292, a great court was held in Berwick, where Edward awarded the throne to John Balliol, who thus became King John I of Scotland. Although Balliol became king, he was effectively subordinate to England from the beginning. Edward I increasingly interfered in Scottish affairs, forced Balliol into submission, and even humiliated him by bringing him before an English court as an ordinary defendant. This led the Scottish lords to gradually strip Balliol of power, and in 1295 they concluded an alliance with France, later known as the Auld Alliance. Edward responded with invasion. In March 1296, he captured and sacked the port of Berwick, in April crushed the Scottish army at Dunbar, and in July forced John Balliol to abdicate. At a ceremony in Stracathro, the royal insignia were torn from Balliol's tabard, and the people mockingly began to call him Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. Scotland thus came under direct English control, and the nobility was forced to swear oaths of loyalty to Edward. Several later descriptions of Wallace's appearance have survived. The chronicler Walter Bower, in his Scotichronicon from the mid-15th century, describes Wallace as an exceptionally large man. He supposedly had the body of a giant, broad hips, strong arms and legs, all limbs firm and powerful. Blind Harry went even further, claiming that Wallace was 7 feet tall, that is, over 2 meters. This height is almost certainly a literary exaggeration, but it shows how strongly Wallace was perceived in later Scottish tradition as a hero of superhuman proportions. Some historians believe that William Wallace must have had military experience even before 1297, otherwise he would not have been capable of leading such a successful uprising against the English. As a younger son of a minor landholder, he may have sought a career outside the family inheritance, and military service was a natural opportunity. The wars of King Edward I in Wales offered an ideal environment for young men to gain experience as mercenaries. An interesting clue is Wallace's personal seal, which bears the image of an archer. This may suggest that he served as an archer in the English army and gained his military skills there. In May 1297, an event occurred in the town of Lanark that is considered the first documented mention of William Wallace. He led an attack on the English administration there and killed the local sheriff, William de Heselrigge. The most reliable contemporary account comes from the Chronicle Scala Chronica by Thomas Gray, whose father directly participated in the incident. According to this source, a clash broke out during a court session led by Heselrigge. Wallace, with the help of a person named Innes, whom some later authors identified as his wife, managed to escape, but soon returned with a group of supporters, attacked the sheriff and his men, killed Heselrigge, nearly killed Thomas Gray the Elder as well, and burned several houses. What exactly Wallace was doing in Lanark and whether this was a spontaneous conflict or pre-planned part of a wider uprising remains unclear. However, already in the 15th century, a much more romantic version of the story emerged. Blind Harry claimed it was revenge for the death of Wallace's wife, Marion Braveheart of Lamington, whom Heselrigge had allegedly killed. According to this version, William and Marion fell in love but decided not to marry until Scotland was freed from English rule. In another version, they secretly married and even had a daughter. They lived apart to avoid drawing attention. Wallace visited Marion in secret until one fatal Sunday after Mass, when William argued with English soldiers and cut one of them down with his sword. Along with other Scots, Wallace killed about 50 English soldiers before being outnumbered and retreating into Marion's house. The sheriff Heselrigge then arrived, demanding their surrender. Marion tried to delay him so Wallace could escape, but the soldiers broke down the door and killed her on the spot. Wallace fled, but that same day decided to take revenge. At night, he came to the sheriff's house and split Heselrigge's head from top to collarbone with a single downward blow. This version became very popular, but historians do not consider it reliable. Modern scholars, such as Ed Archer, even question the very existence of Marion Braveheart. She does not appear in contemporary sources and was first mentioned only in the revised edition of Blind Harry's poem in 1570. It was probably a deliberate construction by the Bailey family of Lamington, who wanted to claim kinship with Wallace and gain political favor with Mary, Queen of Scots. The film Braveheart retells these events very differently. Wallace's wife is named Murren, because the filmmakers did not want her to be confused with Marion from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, released 4 years earlier. The film presents Murren as Wallace's only love, whom he secretly marries and whose brutal execution by the English sparks the uprising. According to the chronicles, there is no evidence that the rebellion began because of a personal tragedy. After the dramatic events in Lanark, William Wallace did not stop. In June 1297, he joined forces with William Douglas, and together they launched an attack on Scone. The English justiciar William de Ormsby was forced to flee, and the Scots gained control of the town, which also had great symbolic significance. It was traditionally the place of Scottish coronations. Shortly afterward, Douglas was captured, but Wallace continued his campaign and gradually prepared the ground for the future clash at Stirling Bridge. Wallace built a base in the dense forests of Ettrick, from where he launched raids against English garrisons and their Scottish collaborators. The most famous of these raids was the attack on the Bishop's Palace in Ancrum, which showed that Wallace did not hesitate to strike even those who posed as spiritual authorities while supporting the occupiers. At the same time, Andrew Murray was leading his own uprising in the north of the country, and their paths gradually converged. The two men joined forces and united two previously separate centers of resistance. Their cooperation culminated in the Battle of Stirling Bridge. On September 11, 1297, the army led by William Wallace and Andrew Murray clashed with English forces near Stirling, a place considered the gateway to Scotland. On the English side stood John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, together with the royal treasurer Hugh de Cressingham. The English arrived at Stirling on September 9 and found that the Scots held a strong position on Abbey Craig, north of the River Forth. The river could only be crossed by a narrow wooden bridge, wide enough for at most 2 or 3 men side by side. An alternative ford existed several kilometers upstream, but Surrey, influenced by Cressingham, rejected this option and chose the risky direct crossing. The English army numbered approximately 8,000 to 10,000 infantry and about 3,000 cavalry, while the Scots had around 5,000 to 6,000 men, mainly spearmen. Surrey ordered the infantry to cross first, followed by the heavy cavalry. The Scots waited, and only when a significant part of the English force, about 2,000 men, had crossed to the northern bank did they attack. Wallace and Murray ordered their men to form dense spear formations known as schiltrons, which could withstand even heavy cavalry. At the decisive moment, the Scots descended from the heights and struck. The English infantry was pushed back against their own cavalry, causing massive chaos. The attack was devastating, the heavy cavalry failed, the infantry was trapped in a bend of the river with no escape route and slaughtered. Only a small group of knights led by Marmaduke Thweng managed to fight their way back across the bridge. Surrey, who had remained on the southern bank with part of the army, lost his nerve, ordered the bridge destroyed, and retreated toward Berwick, effectively leaving the Scots in control of the lowlands. English losses were catastrophic. Chroniclers report about 100 fallen knights and around 5,000 infantry. Among the dead was Hugh de Cressingham. According to the Lanercost Chronicle, his body was desecrated. Wallace had a wide strip of skin cut from his body from head to heel and made it into a shoulder strap for his sword. This gruesome episode became a symbol of the Scottish victory. Scottish losses are unknown, but among the dead soon was Andrew Murray, who succumbed to his wounds in November 1297. Although this battle is one of the most visually impressive in Braveheart, showing brutal medieval warfare, bare Scottish backsides, English archers, and William Wallace swinging a two-handed sword, it happened very differently in reality. Two key elements were missing in the film: the presence of the Scottish commander Andrew de Murray, and the Stirling Bridge itself, which gave the battle its name. In the film, the English are defeated in open field combat, where the Scots win through wildness and determination rather than tactical advantage. The famous two-handed sword wielded by the film version of William Wallace in Braveheart during the Battle of Stirling Bridge is more a cinematic prop than a historically accurate weapon. In reality, it is a type of heavy Scottish sword that began to appear only in the 15th century and reached its greatest popularity a century later, long after Wallace's death. Its inspiration is the so-called Wallace sword, now displayed in the National Wallace Monument in Stirling. According to tradition, it belonged to William Wallace himself. The sword is impressively large, about 1.63 meters long and weighing around 2.7 kilograms. Already in 1505, King James IV ordered its hilt, scabbard, and guard to be repaired, showing that it was already considered an important symbol at that time. Modern examinations have revealed that the sword consists of 3 parts, and only the lowest part of the blade could actually date back to the 13th century, the period of Wallace's life. The other parts, the hilt, guard, and part of the blade, are later additions, probably replaced during later repairs. For this reason, historians regard the Wallace sword primarily as a symbol of national identity and resistance, rather than a guaranteed authentic weapon that Wallace truly used in battle. Immediately after the battle, Wallace assumed the title of Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland and launched a campaign into northern England. The Scottish army invaded Northumberland and Cumberland, plundering and burning the countryside. English sources record the flight of civilians and soldiers into fortified towns, such as Newcastle, and widespread devastation in rural areas. Some later sources claim that Wallace burned as many as 700 villages, but modern historians consider this figure exaggerated. What is certain is that when Wallace returned to Scotland, his army was burdened with loot, which increased his prestige. At the end of 1297, Wallace was, according to both contemporary and later accounts, knighted. According to some versions, he was dubbed a knight by one of three major Scottish nobles: Robert Bruce of Carrick, the Earl of Strathern, or the Earl of Lennox. In the spring of 1298, the English king Edward I launched another invasion. He assembled a new, larger army and in the summer marched into Scotland. His forces included about 2,500 cavalry and approximately 12,500 infantry. Among them were experienced English and Welsh archers equipped with longbows. Wallace cautiously avoided direct confrontation, retreating before Edward's forces and using scorched earth tactics that prevented the English from obtaining food and supplies. This strategy was almost successful, and the shortage of provisions brought Edward's army to the brink of mutiny. Edward advanced through central Scotland and was close to abandoning the pursuit when, on July 21st, he learned that Wallace's army was encamped near Falkirk by the River Carron. The following day, Edward forced Wallace into battle. Wallace commanded a much smaller force, about 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, but occupied a strong position on a slope south of the town, with an almost impassable marsh in front of him. When the English approached on July 22nd, Wallace divided the Scottish army into 4 large schiltrons, circular combat formations. Each schiltron consisted of tightly packed infantry arranged in ranks and armed with long iron spears pointing outward toward the enemy. Archers were positioned between the schiltrons, and a cavalry reserve under the command of John Comyn stood behind them. Wallace apparently hoped that the English cavalry would become trapped in the marsh, as he did not take serious measures to protect the Scottish flanks. Edward I first deployed his heavy cavalry, which quickly scattered the Scottish cavalry. The Scottish horsemen were mostly nobles whose loyalty to Wallace was questionable. Many of them owned lands in England or had relatives held as hostages by Edward. Most of them fled without engaging the enemy. Next came the English infantry and, above all, the Welsh archers, whose longbows were able to shower the schiltrons with arrows from medium range. Once gaps appeared in the tightly packed formations, the English sent forward their heavy cavalry and infantry. They broke into the disrupted schiltrons and turned the battle in their favor. The Scots suffered heavy losses. Important commanders such as Sir John de Graham and Sir John Stuart were killed. Wallace himself escaped by retreat, but his military reputation suffered, and he began to appear as a weak leader in the eyes of more influential Scottish commanders. The Battle of Falkirk represented a great victory for the English, but not a turning point. Edward I was unable to use his success to definitively subjugate Scotland. His army was exhausted, plagued by disease and shortages of supplies. Already in early September 1298, he was forced to withdraw to Carlisle. Wallace resigned from the office of Guardian of Scotland in December, and leadership of the resistance was taken over by Robert Bruce and John Comyn. The defeat at Falkirk revealed the weaknesses of the Scottish army and Wallace's leadership, but it also became a lesson for future battles. 16 years later, Robert Bruce used a similar schiltron tactic at the Battle of Bannockburn, this time combined with well-organized cavalry and advantageous terrain. After the battle, Wallace turned to diplomatic activities. A letter from the French King Philip IV from November 1300 has survived, in which he instructs his envoys at the papal court to assist Wallace. This testifies to Wallace's presence in France and possibly to his intention to continue on to Rome, although it is not certain whether he actually made the journey. Around 1304, he reappeared in Scotland and took part in minor skirmishes, for example at Hapreux and Ernside. However, as Robert Bruce reconciled with the English king, Scottish resistance gradually began to collapse. William Wallace evaded English capture until he was finally betrayed and captured on August 5, 1305, at Robroyston near Glasgow. He was seized by the Scottish knight John de Menteith, who at that time was loyal to the English King Edward I. Wallace was transported to London, where he was imprisoned and then brought to trial in Westminster Hall. The main charge was treason against the English king. Wallace defended himself by stating that he had never sworn loyalty to Edward and therefore, in his view, could not have committed treason. Nevertheless, he was found guilty, because the English crown considered all of Scotland to be its fief, and therefore all its inhabitants to be subjects of the English king. In addition to treason, Wallace was also accused of cruelty and atrocities committed against the civilian population during the war. The English side claimed that he spared no one regardless of age or gender, and that he showed no mercy even to monks and nuns. These accusations were based mainly on English chronicles and had a strong propagandistic character. Their factual basis remains uncertain, and it is possible that the claims were exaggerated in order to justify his exemplary punishment. After the sentence was passed and William Wallace was condemned for treason, on August 23, 1305, he was led out of Westminster Hall and taken to the Tower of London. From there, according to the custom of the time for those convicted of treason, he was stripped naked and tied by the legs behind a horse, which dragged him through the streets of London to the place of execution at the Elms in the Smithfield district. At the place of execution, Wallace was first hanged and nearly strangled to death, but he was cut down before dying so that he could be castrated and disemboweled alive, with his entrails burned before his eyes. He was then beheaded and his body was quartered. His head was dipped in tar to slow decomposition and displayed on a spike on London Bridge as a warning to other opponents. Later, it was joined by the heads of Wallace's brother John and his Scottish companions Simon Fraser and John of Strathbogie, who were also executed. Wallace's limbs were sent out and displayed in 4 different places: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, to deter others from rebellion. The place of Wallace's execution is located near today's St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where a memorial plaque was unveiled on April 8, 1956. It bears the Latin inscription, Dico tibi virum libertas optima rerum nunquam servali sub nexu vivito fili, which translates as, I tell you the truth, freedom is the best of all things, my son. Never live your life as a slave. It also bears the old Scottish battle cry in Gaelic, Bas Agus Buaid, death and victory. In 1869, near the site of his victory at Stirling Bridge, the National Wallace Monument was built, a tall tower that remains an important national monument to this day. The so-called Wallace sword is now kept inside this tower. And that concludes the story of the real William Wallace, the Scottish national hero. What do you think about his life and deeds? Would you like to hear more stories about similar historical figures whose lives you may know from films? Write to us in the comments.